So, the Bhagavad Gita. Getting right into it, what is the Bhagavad Gita? So, this is a part of the Mahabharata, and the Mahabharata is one of two Sanskrit epic poems, they're known as. So, there are two in total, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And the Mahabharata is over 100,000 shlokas. And a shloka is basically a poetic form. So in Sanskrit, it's kind of like, a haiku or something, like a form in which poems are written. And so a shloka, there's 100,000 of them in the Mahabharata in total, and that equals approximately 1.8 million words. So the Mahabharata is about 6 inches thick, and the Bhagavad Gita is basically one tiny part of it. So it covers a few chapters, so 17 chapters within one of the parvas, which is kind of like one section of the Mahabharata. So just to give you an idea of how massive this epic is, and it's attributed to sage Vyasa, which is one of the ancient sages in Hinduism, in the Indian tradition, and he's also makes an appearance in the Mahabharata as well. So the story is said to have been in approximately 3000 BCE, so before the Common Era, and it's not known really whether it's like a specific time, because obviously it's so long ago. It's one of the oldest texts in the Indo-European language, so it is just assumed to be around this time. And so the Bhagavad Gita is 700 verses in the Mahabharata, and these 700 verses contain 18 chapters, or are broken down in 18 chapters. And basically, it's written as a dialogue between Lord Krishna and Arjuna. So Prince Arjuna is a warrior prince, and it's all about Arjuna's struggle in this time. And so it's about this war that happened. So the Mahabharata is about a poem about this war that took place. And so Krishna, Lord Krishna, is an incarnation of one of the Hindu Trinity gods, Vishnu. So Vishnu is the preserver. He is the god that's in charge of maintaining dharma and preserving basically the world. And so this is an incarnation. Krishna is an incarnation of Lord Vishnu. And so the Bhagavad Gita is just narrating this entire dialogue that happens between Prince Arjuna, and Lord Krishna. Its relevance to yoga, it's one of, the first time we hear yoga is back in the Rig Veda, so even further back, but its relevance to yoga is that it is talking about what yoga is, how to attain yoga, what is a yogi. So it's basically showing that yoga is way more than just asana. And so if we look at what does the Bhagavad Gita have with what we know as kind of modern postural yoga, well, maybe not so much. But if we open up the ideas that we might have surrounding what is yoga, we can see that yoga can be about much more than just what we're doing with our physical bodies. The Bhagavad Gita, this discussion between Lord Krishna and Prince Arjuna is basically Arjuna is tasked to go into battle to try there's a war over property. So it's the Kurukshetra war, and it's between two families, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, and they're fighting over this. In the Mahabharata, they're fighting over this land, and so Arjuna's dilemma is that he needs to fight in this war and potentially kill his family members, because on the opposite side are his cousins, his uncles, many of his relatives. So his personal dilemma, or his anguish, is that he needs to fight and potentially kill his family members. And so the dialogue is going back and forth between Arjuna and Krishna about how can he live with himself if he were to end up killing somebody, like an uncle, a cousin that he respects, that he loves. He would have so much grief for them. And so Krishna ends up saying that this is your duty. There's a lot of talk and one of the main focuses in the Bhagavad Gita is about your swadharma. And dharma is your soul's purpose, and swadharma is like your own. So when we speak to swadharma, we're talking about like your purpose in this journey. And then when you become absorbed in that dharma, that's when it's your soul's dharma. Krishna says to Arjuna that it is your swadharma, your duty to be a warrior. And so you should follow your duty and participate in this war, in this battle, and not have any attachments to the action or the results of your actions. That's a big concept in the Gita as well, is that you should perform all actions as selfless actions and have no attachment to the outcome of these actions. And so he says to Arjuna, you should perform your duties as a warrior. That is his purpose, and do it without worrying about what happens. One of the questions that came in was about how can a book or a text about that's justifying killing, or basically saying that, war is okay, how can a book that's about war and going into battle just because it's your duty be looked at as a guide to live a moral life? One of the ways that it's described is as more of a representation of a battle, as opposed to actually about a literal battle. And so if we look at this this Mahabharata as an example, or this dialogue as an example of the internal battles that we all go through on a regular basis, especially about our big life decisions, then we can sort of take it in and see it as more of less of a literal sense, and take it more figuratively, and look at it as more of a metaphor for how we can how we can observe this inner conflict and look at what comes up when we have these inner conflicts. And then another question that came in was, how does the Bhagavad Gita pertain to yoga? And there's a lot of talk of yoga within the Bhagavad Gita, and it's talking about yoga as a practice, but also as more of a way of being. So you can be absorbed in yoga, which is that union, by practicing yoga. So it's not just something that you do, but it's also something that you can enter into, if that makes sense. And So they talk, it's spoken of a lot in the Bhagavad Gita, and also the different forms of yoga, or the different paths of yoga that you might follow based on your own inherent characteristics and personalities. And so these different forms of yoga that are talked about are karma yoga, jnana yoga, and bhakti yoga. This is the yoga of action, the yoga of knowledge, and the yoga of devotion. These different types of yoga are available based on our own natural inherent tendencies, predispositions, personalities, characteristics. And so we can follow the path that's best suited towards our own inherent nature. There's also a lot of discussion as to what is the best path for the majority of people in the Gita, and what's kind of like the easier path. So karma yoga, being the yoga of selfless action, is one of the easier yogas to sort of follow and to go along with. And even though at one point Arjuna wants to follow the path, he wants to renunciate all his duties and everything and go off and become a jnana yogi, Krishna at one point says that it is better to do your own dharma, your own purpose, imperfectly, than to do another's duty perfectly. So it's better to follow your own purpose and not maybe do it perfectly than it is to follow somebody else's and do it perfectly. Is one of the key lessons in there. So there's so many. This is a text that is similar to some of the other important religious texts that speaks to how to deal with the struggles of our everyday life, and how to live a life that's purposeful and meaningful, and how to go through life in a way that is going to help you with have the least amount of suffering and the most amount of peace. And it also speaks to how we can even die in a way that is peaceful. Is the Bhagavad Gita religious? Well, it's certainly a part of what we know as Hinduism, which is actually just a term that we basically came from the British colonization of India. It was never really just one religion. Hinduism is known now, and kind of like everybody in India, they call themselves a Hindu and say they practice Hinduism, but it used to be like way more different religions, and then it kind of all just got branched into one. So the Bhagavad Gita is certainly part of Hinduism, and a lot of the concepts within Hinduism come from the Bhagavad Gita, and the Bhagavad Gita also speaks to the concepts that were already part of other religions that were predominant at that time. And so definitely there is religious context to it, but so some of the specific things that it might not be a part of your faith, and that's perfectly okay. It doesn't mean it's a not relevant. But some of the concepts in it, specifically like speaking of reincarnation, so this is a big part of most of the Hindu religions, is this concept of reincarnation, and that when your physical body ceases to exist, the soul never dies. And so the soul just moves from one physical experience to the next physical experience and the next physical experience. And this entire cycle of moving from one experience to the next is called samsara. And so when the idea of yoga is achieving liberation or breaking this cycle of samsara. And so once you are able to achieve the highest states of yoga, you can become liberated and self-realized and break free from this never-ending cycle of death and rebirth. Yeah, so that's one of the comment or the concepts within that. It definitely will have like a religious context to it, but there is also so much within the Gita that is relevant to even just how to go about our daily lives in a way that can give us more peace and more sense of purpose, and just help us really align with our truths. And so that's one of the reasons that I love this text. And if you're not too familiar with it, I'll just talk a little bit more about the different commentaries and translations. So because it's written in Sanskrit, for those who aren't Sanskrit scholars, you will need to read a translation that has been done by somebody who's studied Sanskrit. So what happens is, in these translations and how Sanskrit is written and how these shlokas are put out, is that the Sanskrit, it's just like one word after the other, and it doesn't always make a lot of sense. Yate chase tata kuru, and the literal translation of it is just talking, it just says, take it and do as you like. And so it needs to have more context than that in relation to the entire description and dialogue that is going on. So a lot of the translations that are out there, and I don't know how many there are. So what happens is, in these translations, you are getting the translators' own opinions and their own backgrounds and their own interpretations and what they've learned. It's almost like it's tainted with their own understanding. And so they vary drastically from translation to translation. And so it can be really interesting to read different translations and get different ideas from them. And some of them, if you've ever tried to read a translation and it was really hard to follow, I know that's what happened my first time with the first translation I tried to read. I didn't understand what the heck they were talking about. And like I could understand it was a dialogue, but then it would go into this huge commentary and then go back to the dialogue, and I kept getting lost in it. And so it took reading another translation of it for me to see it as a whole story. And this is just me personally, to see it as a whole story, to then understand what the other author was trying to do. Originally, I didn't understand that's what was happening, that they were trying to translate the actual shloka line by line and then give a huge background description, similar to, if you've read the Yoga Sutras, similar what happens with the Yoga Sutras is that you need somebody who's studied Sanskrit extensively, classical Sanskrit, who can kind of more than just translate these words, because if you do a direct translation, it doesn't make sense. You can look word for word, translate what they mean, and it doesn't make sense. A lot of the words don't even have proper English translation, so we kind of just have to come up with a concept or an idea that best describes what that word is trying to mean. So I recommend trying different commentaries, different translations, especially if you have read one that didn't really sit with you. It was like my first experience when I just didn't get it. It took me ages and ages to get through, and I think it took actually going back to it again after reading another one to understand, to even like be able to finish it, definitely to understand it. So I recommend picking up a different copy, and you don't even have to finish the first one. If it doesn't really make sense, you don't like how it's written, then you can get another copy. There are a couple that I really like. So, there's a question, so maybe let's see what they say. That's what was going to be my question. As a beginner to the Bhagavad Gita, what translation would you recommend as a first? So it depends. So I'll give you a couple options, and I'll talk about them and how they differ. So because they do differ quite a bit in the ideas and in the concepts. And even one of the questions I had about this live was which commentary was I going to be discussing, and it's like I don't even want to discuss a single one because there's so much that changes from commentary or translation to translation that to me I kind of like to look at as many as possible and just get the ideas that resonate with me the most. So one that is really, really simple and just like a broad overview of the story is called A Walkthrough for Westerners. I think it's called the Bhagavad Gita, A Walkthrough for Westerners by, I believe his name is Jack Hawley, Hawley, is a good one. There's God Talks with Arjuna, but this one, it's at least easy to read. This one is a little more, if you've read the autobiography of a yogi and you like the autobiography of a yogi, then you'll be able to get this one pretty well. God Talks with Arjuna. If you haven't, again, it's one of those that can be kind of a little difficult to grasp, and you might need a little bit more time to go through the sections. This is not a book that you'll just read cover to cover. It's one that you really need to read, like sometimes even verse by verse, and just sit on it and simmer on it and let it kind of like percolate. Because there's so much knowledge in these texts, in these scriptures, that it's similar to reading. Like my best comparison is the Bible. It's similar to reading that. Like you wouldn't just pick up the Bible and just read it cover to cover. Or you could, but you wouldn't take enough in. The third is the Bhagavad Gita as it is by Eknath Easwaran, Easwaran. Easwaran. I don't know how to pronounce it, but yes, his first name is Eknath. So those would be the three that I would recommend. There's one by Gandhi as well. That was actually my first one. So that was the first one that when I read it, I was like, oh gosh, I took more from it than I thought, but it really didn't land the first time. So I needed to actually go through it again. So you can obviously look at it, of course, if you'd like, but it took a little bit for me to go back to it and actually understand what was going on in it. There was another question, more about not the Bhagavad Gita, but just something in yoga. And the question was, what is the difference between Hatha and Ashtanga? And this is a very interesting question. I do remember myself having this question a few years ago. If we are looking at asana, the difference between Hatha and Ashtanga, so Hatha Yoga Asana and Ashtanga Yoga Asana or Ashtanga Vinyasa, is that Ashtanga is a set series of poses. And Hatha, it's much more liberal. It's usually a sequence that it's completely made up by the teacher. And some studios, it is more common to be like a gentler form of yoga, just especially in comparison to Ashtanga. But because the question just said Hatha and Ashtanga, I wasn't sure if it was about yoga asanas, so the physical poses, or if it was about these two broad concepts. So now we'll go into the concept. So Hatha Yoga comes from, it means like forceful, or Ha is sun and Ta is like the lunar feminine aspect. And it's about combining these two. And Hatha Yoga is usually a combination of asana, pranayama, meditation techniques. And it came about when we, or yogis, ancient yogis, started getting more concerned with the physical body. So prior to Hatha Yoga was Ashtanga Yoga, which came, Ashtanga meaning the eight-limbed path or eightfold path. Ashtanga Yoga came about in the pre-classical era, where it was about this specific eightfold path, and that comes from the Yoga Sutras typically, but there are some commentaries that even recognize it in the Bhagavad Gita. So some Ashtanga yogis, I presume they were Ashtanga yogis who've translated the Bhagavad Gita, even speak to part of it. It was in the 6th chapter. They speak to yogam, so Yogam, as being representative, or as meaning the eightfold path. So saying how far it goes back is even not specific, not really set in stone or specific. So Ashtanga, though, typically is this eightfold path that comes from the Yoga Sutras. Most commonly is where we find it, and it's the yamas, niyamas, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So these 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. And so if you're looking to kind of differentiate between Hatha Yoga and Ashtanga Yoga, Ashtanga is this like specific framework of like following these things in order to achieve samadhi, which is the eighth limb or eighth rung or eighth anga, and that is the absorption, the meditative absorption. And so this eightfold path leads towards samadhi, and Hatha Yoga is more about preserving and maintaining the physical body so that you can practice yoga. So it does deal with the energies, it does deal with pranayama, it does deal, and then those, in order to get you to be able to meditate, but it's not a specific one after the other, or like do these specific things in order to be able to achieve samadhi. So I hope that answers your question. I think who asked it is not here. So if that didn't answer your question, email me again and I'll try to explain it a little better. Chapter 6, 11 to verse 11 to 12, they speak about how to practice yoga, or it explains how to practice yoga, and it talks about that you need to practice yoga, that you need to go to a sacred place, practice yoga on, it speaks specifically about the type of grass, and then lay a deer skin over top of the grass and then a soft cloth over top of the deer skin, and find a seat that is neither too high nor too low, and that is comfortable, you should sit on it firmly and practice yoga. And it says that when you do this, you're able to purify the heart so that you can control the mind and the senses and be able to achieve yoga. And so that's what a lot of these texts speak to when they're describing yoga and how to practice yoga. Is it's not about these postures. I see so many questions lately, especially with like everything that's gone on in this past year, from those, if once you come into a role of teaching yoga, in whatever form that it is, there's a lot of questions around like, well, what if I can't do my yoga practice? Like, what if I'm not feeling well? What if I don't practice every day or 5 days a week? And I think this is where a lot of times, or it seems to me, this is where a lot of times we get kind of caught up with this idea that yoga is strictly asana. This is a broad misconception about what yoga is. And if you are not practicing asana, this does not mean you are not a yogi. Yoga is so much more than just asana. In order to be able to practice yoga, or in order to practice yoga, all you need is to be able to sit comfortably and become present and tune in and ignore distractions and basically sit and meditate. And whatever you want to think of as meditation, whatever that word even means to you as well, it's because meditation can often be looked at as just this concentration aspect. But once you're able to just sit and focus and ignore all these distractions and become absorbed in the present and in yourself, your like inner self, that is the yoga. Being present in your everyday life, being able to step back from situations instead of becoming reactive, being able to have difficult conversations that you might not want to have, or be able to tell somebody something that makes you a little bit uncomfortable. It's all yoga. Even our relationships with others, our relationships with ourselves, it's all yoga. And even reading books on yoga is yoga. It's the practice. It's doing something that is for the betterment of your higher self, or for the evolution of your highest self. And that's the yoga. That's what yoga is. It's not about downward facing dog or chaturanga. You don't have to ever do any of that to be a yogi. So that's what I felt that I needed to say about that, and what I've seen coming up lately with a lot of people, and having a little bit of sort of shame around not being able to practice regularly, or not having as long of a practice as they normally have, or you normally have, or as consistent of a practice of asana. This is what I'm speaking of, as you normally have. But to be completely honest, I'm not practicing asana much at all lately. I'm not teaching a lot of asana. When I teach asana, I practice asana. When I don't teach it, I'm not practicing it, because I'm practicing other physical things right now. But do I have a daily yoga practice? Absolutely, because for me, it's not about asana. It's not about the physical postures. And that, I mean, it's not even to me. It's not what it's about. It's just one little tiny part. So Just because you're not practicing asana, you're not able to, does not mean you are any less than anyone else or any other teacher. Don't beat yourself up for it. It's only the physical part, and there's so much more. You reading about yoga, you reading and studying these concepts, more than just reading, but studying these concepts and really trying to understand their meaning and really develop them into wisdom, as opposed to just looking at things as being intellectual knowledge or understanding things intellectually. That's yoga. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Namaste.